This video is a review of bonding and a review of the properties of water. We're going to start on the left-hand side of the grid sheet and talk about elements and atoms first as a quick review. Elements make up our cells. From a biological perspective, they make up everything, right? And we're going to talk about different elements and atoms, different types of elements, and I'm going to use X to represent the electrons, which can also sometimes be written as E minus, okay? The number of electrons in the outer shell of an element help form bonds and determine its reactivity. So the electrons in the outer shell are called the valence electrons, and they help form bonds. These bonds allow structures to be created, and these structures are used to make up the macromolecules that make up our cells and allow our cells to have specific function. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. I'm going to start with oxygen. Okay, oxygen has 8 protons always. Okay, those are found in the nucleus of the atom. The number of neutrons can vary, and if it is an uncharged oxygen atom, it also has 8 electrons. In the inner shell, you always have 2 electrons, and then we need 6 more electrons to make up 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The outer shell of oxygen wants 8 electrons to fill up its outer shell. So 8 electrons is a full outer shell, okay? So it's electronegative, okay? Which means it is an electron acceptor because it wants to fill out its outer valence shell with 8 electrons, okay? So really, oxygen really easily forms 2 bonds, okay? If we look at hydrogen, hydrogen has 1 proton and 1 electron. Protons in the nucleus, the electrons out here. So hydrogen usually likes to form 1 bond. Also, hydrogen can easily be split to separate the proton and the electron. So hydrogen equals 1 proton, which we refer to as H+, and 1 electron, okay? And these can be separated, and the flow of these can be used to transfer energy or do work in our bodies, okay? And I'm just going to use my yellow to separate these, otherwise it's going to get confusing. Next, we have carbon. Carbon is a really, really important element in biology because it is the backbone of organic molecules, okay? Meaning carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acid and when I say nucleic acids, I mean like DNA and RNA. They all have like a carbon that makes up their internal structure with other things attached to it. The reason carbon is the backbone of organic molecules comes down to its number of electrons, okay? Carbon always has 6 protons. It can have a varying number of neutrons, and uncharged it has 6 electrons. So again, 2 electrons go in this inner shell, and then 3, 4, 5, 6. This means that carbon can easily form 4 bonds. And like a Lego with 4 different nubs on it, that means that carbon's versatile and it can easily form a lot of complex structures while still maintaining its stability. Next, we have nitrogen. Nitrogen has 7 protons and 7 electrons. Okay, so again, protons are in the nucleus, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, which means that nitrogen easily forms 3 bonds. 1, 2, 3. what we have with these elements are the 6 most common elements in living organisms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay? All structures, all organic compounds have carbon. Most have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and then some have nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Okay? You can look in the textbook and spend some time figuring out the number of protons and electrons in sulfur and phosphorus, and do the same thing with phosphorus and sulfur that we did for these 4 elements up here. So these elements alone aren't enough to create living organisms. We need to use these elements to form bonds to form more complex structures. So we're actually going to start with a review of polar covalent bonds. In polar covalent bonds, electrons are shared unequally. An example of a polar covalent bond can be found in water. This is a molecule of water, and as we know, water has 2 hydrogens, H2, and 1 oxygen. Okay? Because the oxygen is so electronegative, the electrons, okay, in hydrogen and the electrons in oxygen should be shared equally. So should spend the same time with hydrogen that they spend with oxygen. But because oxygen is so electronegative, it pulls on these electrons, so the electrons spend more time around oxygen. So the electrons are shared, but unequally. They spend more time with oxygen. A consequence of this, what this leads to, is something we refer to as a polar molecule. A polar molecule, okay, is when one side of the molecule has a slightly negative charge, and in this case, the oxygen has a slightly negative charge because the electrons spend more time with the oxygen, and another side of the molecule has a slightly positive charge, which in this case is the hydrogen. This leads to what we refer to as hydrogen bonding. With hydrogen bonds, okay, in the water molecule right here, again, this is the oxygen and these are the hydrogens, the electrons spend more time with the oxygen again, okay? So these bonds right here are the polar covalent bonds, okay? Here's another water molecule. These bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen of one water molecule are polar covalent bonds, okay? So these are polar covalent bonds. Inside one water molecule, you have polar covalent bonds. Between 2 different water molecules, the slightly positive charge of the hydrogen and the slightly negative charge of the oxygen allows them to be attracted to each other like magnets. The bond between the 2 different water molecules is referred to as a hydrogen bond or an H bond. Hydrogen bonds are weak attractions between molecules. These hydrogen bonds lead to a lot of the properties of water, okay? So properties of water that are a result of polarity and hydrogen bonding include cohesive properties. And by cohesive properties, I mean cohesion, water sticking to water, adhesion, water sticking to other things, surface tension, water sticking together on the surface of a body of water, and capillary action, when water is pulled up a plant because it's sticking to itself and to the sides of the plant or a tube or something like that, okay? Other properties of water that are also a result of polarity and hydrogen bonding, okay, include its thermal properties. These thermal properties include high specific heat, high heat of vaporization, etc. Okay. Another property of water that's a result of polarity and hydrogen bonding is universal solvent, that water can dissolve most things. Okay. Other properties of water include pH. That is actually not related to polarity and hydrogen bonding. So these are some of the properties of water. The back of this big sheet details all these properties, the solvent properties, the thermal properties, the cohesive properties. Oh, I even forgot density. And density is related to polarity and hydrogen bonding. Okay. I will do a separate video just on the properties of water, but this gives you an overview to get you started. The second type of bond I want to discuss is a different type of covalent bond. This is a non-polar covalent bond. So polar covalent bonds, the electrons are shared but unequally. The more electronegative element is going to hold on to the electrons more. It doesn't necessarily have to be oxygen. This is just one example of the polar covalent bond within one water molecule. Another type of covalent bond is a non-polar covalent bond. In a non-polar covalent bond, the electrons are shared equally around a molecule. This results in no charge. For instance, with carbon and hydrogen, this CH4, and CH4 is a methane gas. Okay, the electron from hydrogen and the electron from carbon are shared equally, so there's no charge. Carbon is bigger, so you would think it would be a lot more electronegative. However, the way that the methane forms, it forms kind of in like a, I can't draw it, like a pyramid shape. And because the hydrogens are equally spaced, the electrons kind of spend the same amount of time around the carbon and the hydrogen. So again, similarity, polar covalent bonds and non-polar covalent bonds both have electron sharing. Difference, polar covalent bonds, the electrons spend more time with one element than another, or one atom than another. And non-polar covalent bonds, they are shared equally. The second bond we discussed, so we have polar and non-polar covalent bonds. And then separate from those, again, are the hydrogen bonds, which are caused when a hydrogen from one atom, which is slightly positively charged, is attracted to an electronegative atom from a different molecule. So these are two different molecules. This is one water molecule being attracted to another water molecule and creating this hydrogen bond. The last type of bond I want to talk about is the ionic bond. In an ionic bond, electrons are transferred to make a full valence shell, so they're not shared. This creates ions, which are charged atoms that stay together because of the charges. Now, in biology, I always say that polar covalent bonds and non-polar covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds. And if you took chemistry, you'd be like, what are you talking about? It's because of the context. I'm talking about the fact that in biology, these bonds are found in aqueous solutions, aka in water. Ionic bonds often separate in water, whereas covalent bonds don't. So all of the chemistry I'm talking about for biology occurs in water-based solutions, at least on Earth. And so that's why when I talk about strength of bonds, it sounds different in biology than it does in chemistry. So let me give you this example of the ionic bond, okay? Here's sodium. You can see sodium has one single valence electron. It wants to get rid of it because if it gets rid of this valence electron, then its next shell has 8 electrons and is full. Meanwhile, chlorine has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it only wants 1 electron. So this is a match made in heaven, okay? Sodium, or Na, wants to give its electron to chlorine, okay, to make it even. So before this happens, sodium has 11 protons and 11 electrons, and so it's uncharged. And chlorine has 17 protons and 17 electrons. After this happens, okay, when this electron is fully transferred, now, okay, sodium has 11 protons and 10 electrons. So because it has more protons than electrons, it's a positively charged ion, okay? Chlorine is now known as chloride. It has 17 protons and 18 electrons. It is Cl minus. It is negatively charged, right? So this is what we would call salt. Well, it's a type of salt, NaCl, but this is table salt, right? These two stay together when they're not in water because the negatively charged ion is attracted to the positively charged ion. But if you put them in water, they dissolve and separate. Okay, so this is an ionic bond right here. So why are we talking about bonding? We're talking about bonding because these bonds are used to make all the structures in our body, and because when we think about making and breaking bonds, we need to think about organisms. Organisms must exchange matter with the environment to grow, to reproduce, and to maintain the homeostatic control of the organism, okay, right? We need food, we need energy, right, to make our body parts. So basically, these elements of life, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, need to make structures and break them apart for all these things to occur. So we're making and breaking bonds, right? Living systems require a constant input of these elements, these molecules, for survival and for repair, right? And when we're talking about these elements, right, we can talk about different organic compounds. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the three elements that make up carbs and lipids. Okay. Proteins use carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. That's proteins. Okay. And then nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA, use carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Okay. So these are the main elements that form bonds to make up our structures. This is the end of this video. In the next video, I will look more in detail at properties of water. Thank you for watching.